Hello, I'm Professor Tim Karoleff, and I'm here today to talk to you about postform. So some of the themes covered in this conversation, and of course further in depth in the paper, are artificial natural, perceptual relativity, inevitability oppression, equitable friction, net things, dream design, and political design. So of course we know that the physical affects the metaphysical, and the reverse is true as well, right? The body produces the mind. The physical, though, is also necessary for communication, as we can see in these proto-cuneiform tablets, right? We utilize symbols such as the vessels to represent beer, and then other wedge-shaped marks to represent amounts within that transaction. And so from this communication, right, communication is necessary for any sort of community building and then conversation among that. So how can we look at design as community conversation? And also we must remember that the physical affects the digital and the virtual, and the reverse of that is also true as well. And again, right, form is essential to any sort of conversation, be it spoken, visual, written, etc. But that perception of what that form is relative to any subject, right? Perspective is unique within any subject that exists based off of that lived experience of the subject. And so we can learn, though, as well, that when a subject encounters art, art has the power of eliciting sensations. This is from Elizabeth Groats, of course, from Deleuze in his studies on Francis Bacon. We can even see with the figure with meat within Batman by Tim Burton, the Joker protects this, saying, "I like this one," right? So it's inspiring these deep sensations within us when we view this. Design also learns from this idea of sensation creation in order to direct action, right? We understand the idea of affordances when we design. And we can look at things like Norman doors to understand bad examples of this, right? The push on a pull handle. And so, how can we combine the emotive capability of art with the technological innovation of design in order to craft more equitable presents and futures through design? Right? Because design is inherently political, and that can be obvious within things like the Predator drone, to less obvious like the internet, which of course was designed by neoliberal agents, right? And then even into things afforded by the communication, the internet, like the like button, which has greatly oppressed our society as a whole, right? And largely design has acted as an agent of this neoliberalism, and we've been very complicit with it. And again, we need to figure out how to change this reality. Because really, design is just making a plan. And then we could say that craft is actualizing that plan. And finally, artistry then could be the skill of combining design and craft to tell a culturally relevant story. And this has the potential for infinite combinations, right? We've only been limited so far by the canon. And that's that Euro-American centric philosophy and perspective that promotes a certain patriarchy, right? So what are the possibilities beyond those limiting parameters of what's considered quote unquote natural, right? Because really right now we have this great potential as designers because of deconstruction, we're able to understand that all objects are systems, right? There's not a single thing anymore. Everything is a net thing. It's connected to everything else, either physically or virtually, right? Either directly or indirectly. But those connections and the understanding of them, right, are limited by a subject's relationship with the physical, right? Because that perception of the physical then affects the metaphysical, right? And differently abled people still imagine based off of their aesthetic understanding of the world. Right, this is Daniel Kish utilizing echolocation to move around, right? But it still requires physical understanding for him to understand the reality. Because this perception affects imagination, right? We can only use what is known in our reality to imagine future realities, right? But these limitations and barriers can be cut through with the idea of critical consciousness and helping to really see what makes up the greater systems at play around us. And as designers, we of course see these limitations as parameters, and then we see parameters as opportunities, right? Because the politics of any design that's created, right, directly affects power relationships. And we can, as designers, either utilize that knowledge to maintain status quo power relationships or inspire dreams of equitable reimaginations of what the present is and the future can be. Because really, it's design's responsibility to question traditions, because traditions are only useful if they are questioned and determined to still be relevant. Some traditions need to die out, some need to continue on, right? But we can only determine that by design if we question those directly. Because design is really a culture creator, right? We understand past societies based off of their cultural artifacts. And so what are we leaving behind and what are we putting forward as future and current cultural artifacts? And then really, right, these cultural artifacts have expanded because of being net things beyond that to social, political, cultural, and economic artifacts, right? Because these physical objects exist in that politics that they have, right? They have the potential to operate as oppression agents, which too often as designers, we fall into the trap of because of our deep and inherent relationship with capitalism and the market, right? But design really is a universal act, right? It's anyone's understanding, whether that's human, non-human, animal, object, right? Everything that exists is trying to better its situation within its environment. This is design. It's creating a plan of action to try and better its standing, right? But unfortunately, we know that access is not universal or equitable within these societies, right? Because in reality, as we just discussed, design is survival, right? Again, it's how humans attempt to affect their environment to make their life better. And so beyond that, I'd like to prompt the idea that we look at design as effective versus ineffective over good versus bad to consider the success of it, right? We could understand that the AK-47 is probably one of the most effective industrial designs for its intended use of all time. But we could very deeply debate whether that has been good or bad result to the planet from that, right? Because good versus bad is qualitative. Whichever side you're on, you're going to have a different perspective based off of your life history and experiences there and what propaganda you've been sold, right? So we can also understand through this good versus bad as qualitative, just the simple object by Alessi, right? Sometimes kitsch makes a lot of sense within a certain space. Other spaces aren't going to really adopt and understand or have this object be successful within it, right? So context is also important to determining success and effectiveness or ineffectiveness within a design. And hopefully within those specific contexts, we can apply this more quantitative idea of effective and ineffective versus the qualitative ideas of good versus bad, right? And so speaking on that, I'd like to look at the conservative and progressive sales pitches that kind of exist within contemporary society. And so Duncombe's done a lot of good writing on this in Dream or Nightmare, reimagining progressive politics in an age of fantasy, right? And so our understanding is that the conservative sales pitch is you can achieve anything you want to if you just try hard, right? Where the progressive sales pitch is one of sacrifice, right? If you sacrifice for the greater good, everything will be better as a whole, right? Off the bat, one of those is much more enticing and appealing than the other, right? The one that urges you to chase your dreams and you'll have the opportunity to achieve them versus the one that's telling you to give up some of what you have, right? And so we can understand through that, right? Because the conservative pitch is quantifiably false. That doesn't exist in contemporary society anymore. So we can really see, especially within this past administration, 2016 to 2020 in the United States, that fiction is stronger than fact. Truth has not been winning out. It is the fictive imagination that does. Right? And so this is just promoting more and more of this classism. And then classism is in itself imagination oppression. It's just existing to increase the wealth gap that is already abhorrent. right? And so this all utilizes neoliberalism as a tool to maintain the status quo. And again, design has been incredibly complicit here within this. But we can see even the proof of this lie and that it's not fact and is fiction, right? With the GameStop and Robinhood saga that came about recently, right? Shows the gamification of the stock market, right? As I guess we could say, the proletariat discovered the rules of the game and used those rules against the bourgeoisie, right? The bourgeoisie then enacted new rules to prevent the proletariat from competing in that market, right? Thus proving the market actually isn't free. And so, with that being said, I'd really like to look at an object that is a lowercase d design object, right? There's no traceable designer of this designed object, yet it really enacts and represents certain ideologies that we've just been discussing here. And of course, again, right, effective versus ineffective, because I am wholly against Trump and his supporters and everything that this object stands for, right? But we have to understand the idea of opposition research and how valuable that can be. So one of the great advantages of this hat, right, is that the slogan is so simple. Keep it simple, stupid, right? Make America great again. And beyond that, the red is incredibly noticeable, right? It builds that conservative identity. The red back, the white text, right? It's very understanding where you stand within society when you wear this object atop your head. It also can be worn both at work and public. So again, it's having that social and that economic representation coming through. And right, and again, it's very easy to understand and get across what the ideology or the fiction of it is, right? But that fiction disguises itself as fact. That A, there ever was a time when America was great, and B, that it needs to return backwards to that thought of and fictive time. Right, so it's this return to perceived potential, this idea of the American dream, of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, of upward mobility, that we understand is completely false, right? It's an ideology of the dangling carrot. It's something that can never be achieved. It's always there and enticing, but always out of reach. Again, it's this quantitatively fictive ideology, right, that is still desirable because of the sales pitch that was made for it. So, how can we as progressives learn from these conservative tactics? And so something that I think we need to look at is this idea of dream design, right? We don't want to be doubters anymore, believing only in the kind of pessimism of truth and reality here, right? Or even if there's optimism in that truth, right? We have to take on this idea of belief, right? Of faith, of something higher that could be fictive, right? To inspire a better future that may actually be factual, right? How can we utilize these lies or stories to inspire quantitatively more equitable existence? Right? And speaking of equity, along with inspiring this, I think this idea of equitable friction is really intriguing, right? Because friction is always there, and whenever we're presented with something that's natural, like these power relationships, we can utilize friction to move beyond those, right? Because, again, all design is political, whether we like it or not. And so the idea is that more voices heard can only result in a better society. And so I'd now like to look at a project that I'm working on called It Takes a Village, Lend a Hand. And the idea here is combining the grotesque, right? It's utilizing this idea of the grotesque to question what is considered natural to then inspire communal change. So beyond that, really what I'm interested in is that I am curious about how critical consciousness can engage with aesthetics to deconstruct the presentations of natural and artificial so that design can act as political praxis to catalyze imaginations toward more equitable futures. Thank you.